What if the feeling that you are a separate self, a distinct enclosed I moving through a world of other separate things, is the single greatest illusion ever constructed, and the mystics of every civilization spent their entire lives trying to wake you up from it, not metaphorically, not as a comforting idea to make you feel less lonely on a Tuesday afternoon, literally, structurally, as a description of what reality actually is beneath the surface of appearances. You've heard the phrase before, we are all one. It gets printed on tote bags, it gets whispered at the end of yoga classes, it floats through songs and speeches and the last paragraphs of self-help books. And every time you hear it, some part of you nods, and another part of you quietly wonders, but what does that actually mean? Because from where you're standing, you are very clearly not the person next to you. You have your own memories, your own pain, your own hunger, your own name. The separation feels undeniable. It feels like the most obvious fact in the universe. And yet, for over 2,500 years, the most rigorous, penetrating, philosophically sophisticated minds humanity has ever produced, Plotinus in Alexandria, the sages of the Upanishads in the forests of ancient India, Rumi in the dust of 13th century Persia, Meister Eckhart in the monasteries of medieval Germany, Jacob Boehme staring into a pewter dish and suddenly understanding the whole cosmos. Every single one of them arrived at the same radical conclusion. The separation is not real, or rather it is real at one level and completely dissolved at another. And the level at which it dissolves is the level that is most fundamentally true. So the question this video is really asking is not whether we are all one. The question is, what are you exactly that could ever have believed you were separate in the first place? And what happens to you, to your entire experience of being alive, when that belief begins to crack? We'll begin where all good philosophical journeys begin, with a Greek who stared into the nature of existence so long and so deeply that he came back with something that still hasn't been fully absorbed by Western civilization. Then we'll move into the ancient forests of India, into the firelit rooms of Sufi mystics, into the visions of Christian contemplatives who saw God not as a being above them, but as the very ground they were standing on. And at the end, we'll arrive somewhere unexpected, somewhere that makes the question, are we all one, feel not like a spiritual platitude, but like the most urgent, personal, alive question you've ever sat with. Because there is a specific experience, described in nearly identical language across cultures that never met, across millennia that never touched, that suggests the unity isn't a theory. It's something that can be directly perceived, and once perceived, even briefly, nothing looks quite the same again. So let's begin with the one question that makes all of this possible. What is the deepest thing you are? There is a philosopher who lived in the 3rd century, in the cosmopolitan heat of Alexandria and Rome, who never wrote a single word during his lifetime. Everything we know about him came through a student who followed him for years, listening, transcribing, piecing together the architecture of a mind that seemed to operate at a frequency most people couldn't quite reach. His name was Plotinus, and the system he built, the one his student Porphyry eventually assembled into 6 books called the Enneads, is perhaps the most sustained, rigorous, and beautiful attempt in Western history to describe why the feeling of separation is not the truth of what you are. Plotinus began with a question that sounds simple and turns out to be bottomless. Where does everything come from? Not in a scientific sense, not atoms, not the Big Bang. He meant something more intimate than that. He meant, what is the source of existence itself? What is the ground from which being emerges? His answer was what he called the One. Not one as in a number, not one as in a single object among other objects. The One for Plotinus is what exists before any distinction is possible, before subject and object, before inside and outside, before you and the world. It is the absolute overflowing source of everything, and it is not a thing. It is the condition that makes things possible at all. He described it as radiating existence the way the sun radiates light, not by choice, not through effort, but simply because that is its nature. Reality for Plotinus is a continuous emanation from this single, inexhaustible source. From the One flows what he called the nous, sometimes translated as intellect or spirit, but really it's closer to the divine mind that contains all archetypal forms, all possibilities, all the patterns that will eventually become the world you see. And from the nous flows the world soul, the anima mundi, the living, breathing, conscious field that animates all of creation. And from the world soul flows individual souls, you, me, every conscious being. Here is where it becomes personally important. In Plotinus's vision, your individual soul is not a separate thing that was created and placed inside a body. It is an extension of the world soul, the way a ray of sunlight is an extension of the sun. The ray is real. The ray has its own angle, its own particular fall of light. But it is not separate from its source. It never left its source. It only appears to be at a distance from it. The experience of being a separate self for Plotinus is something that happens at the outermost edge of this emanation, where the light of the One has grown so diffuse that it seems to have become something else entirely. Matter, multiplicity, the world of time and bodies and names. But the diffusion is not a rupture. The connection is never actually broken. You have simply, as he put it, forgotten where you came from. Now here is what makes this more than philosophy. Plotinus didn't just theorize about this. He reported it. His student Porphyry tells us that during his lifetime, Plotinus experienced direct union with the One on at least 4 occasions, moments in which the sense of being a separate individual dissolved entirely, and what remained was something he described as pure undivided awareness, not unconsciousness, not sleep, something more awake than ordinary waking life, a state in which the question, "Who am I?" ceased to be a question, because the questioner and the answer had become the same thing. This is the pattern that will repeat itself across every tradition we explore today. It is not just a philosophical position. It is a description of something that can be experienced, and the experience across all these traditions carries the same impossible quality. It feels more real than ordinary reality. It feels like waking up inside a dream you didn't know you were having. But Plotinus was working within a Greek framework, with Greek vocabulary, in a particular historical moment. What makes the unity of consciousness so compelling is that the same essential discovery was made independently, in completely different civilizations, using completely different languages and images. And perhaps nowhere was it explored with more sustained depth and more radical precision than in the forests of ancient India, where a group of seers sat down with a question that still echoes through everything. What is the self at its most fundamental level? And what is its relationship to the universe it appears to inhabit? Their answer was a word, a single Sanskrit syllable that contains, if you follow it far enough, the entire architecture of mystical thought. That word is Brahman. And understanding what the Upanishads meant by it is the key that unlocks something profound, not just about Indian philosophy, but about what the mystics of every civilization were pointing toward when they said, in their different tongues and their different centuries, "We are not separate. We never were." And the part of you that knows this has been waiting very patiently for the part of you that forgot to catch up. There is a sentence in the Chandogya Upanishad, one of the oldest philosophical texts ever written, that has been called the most important sentence in the history of human thought. A father is speaking to his son, Shvetaketu, who has just returned from 12 years of study and is full of the pride of acquired knowledge. The father asks him, "Do you know that by which the unheard becomes heard, the unthought becomes thought, the unknown becomes known?" The son doesn't understand. So the father takes a fig, opens it and asks, "What do you see inside?" "Seeds," says the son. "Take one seed and open it. What do you see inside that?" "Nothing," says the son. And then the father speaks the sentence that changed everything. That subtle essence which you cannot see, that is the reality of the whole universe, that is the truth, that is the self, and that Shvetaketu, thou art, Tattvam Asi. You are that, not you are like that, not you are connected to that, not you are a reflection of that, you are that. The invisible essence that underlies all things, the consciousness that animates the universe, that the Vedic sages called Brahman, is identical to the consciousness that animates you, which they called Atman. The individual soul and the universal soul are not two things maintaining a relationship. They are one thing wearing the temporary costume of apparent distinction. This is the most radical philosophical claim ever made, and it was made thousands of years ago by people sitting in forests without universities, without laboratories, without peer-reviewed journals. They arrived at it through the only instrument they had available, sustained, disciplined attention turned inward. And what they found when they looked deeply enough was not a small, private, personal self. They found the universe looking back at them through their own eyes. The Mandukya Upanishad takes this even further. It describes 4 states of consciousness: waking, dreaming, deep sleep, and a 4th state called Turiya, which means simply the 4th. The first 3 states are familiar. The 4th is the ground that underlies all 3. the pure awareness in which waking, dreaming, and sleeping all arise and dissolve, the way waves arise and dissolve in the ocean. Turiya is not something you achieve or attain. It is what you already are beneath the surface of your changing experiences. The Upanishad says it cannot be described, only pointed toward. It is not internal knowledge, not external knowledge, not both, not neither. It is pure consciousness. It is peace. It is bliss. It is the non-dual self. This is what the sages were calling Brahman. And they were saying, this is you, at the level that doesn't change, at the level that was never born and will never die. Now hold that image, the ocean and its waves, because we're going to carry it forward. Because approximately 18 centuries after the Upanishads were composed, in a completely different part of the world, a philosopher in Alexandria was staring at the same ocean and drawing the same conclusion. But the wave was about to get a name it had never had before. The wave was about to be called the ego. And the story of what the ego is, and why it mistakes itself for the whole ocean, is perhaps the most important story in all of mystical philosophy. The ego, in the tradition that flows from Plotinus through the Neoplatonists and eventually into the mystical currents of medieval Christianity, is not evil. It is not wrong. It is not something to be destroyed. It is something to be understood. The ego is the point of view. It is the particular angle from which the one looks at itself through the lens of an individual life. The problem is not that the ego exists. The problem is when the ego forgets that it is a point of view and begins to believe it is the totality of what exists. Imagine a wave in the ocean that somehow develops the ability to think, and in developing that ability, becomes so fascinated with its own shape, its own height, its own particular movement through the water, that it forgets it is made of ocean. It begins to experience itself as fundamentally different from other waves. It feels the distance between itself and other waves as the primary truth of its existence. It develops preferences, fears, desires, all organized around the project of maintaining and protecting the shape it currently has. This is the human condition, according to virtually every mystical tradition that has ever existed. Not a tragedy, not a punishment, but a forgetting, a temporary narrowing of identity that makes individual experience possible at the cost of awareness of the whole. And here is the first beautiful paradox of the unity teachings. The forgetting is necessary. You cannot have individual experience without it. The wave cannot know itself as a wave without, at some level, distinguishing itself from other waves. The human soul cannot love, cannot create, cannot suffer, cannot grow without the particular angle of vision that individuality provides. The mystics were not trying to eliminate the individual, they were trying to expand it, to restore it to its original context, which is the ocean from which it was never actually separated. Proclus, the 5th century Neoplatonist, who carried Plotinus's work to its most systematic expression, described this as a great circular movement. Everything emanates from the one, everything returns to the one, and the return is not a loss of individuality, but its fulfillment. The soul that has fully realized its unity with the source does not disappear. It becomes, in some sense, more fully itself, because it now knows itself not just as a wave, but as the ocean waving. This is not Eastern philosophy versus Western philosophy. This is a single current of insight that surfaces in different rivers at different times. And nowhere does it surface with more breathtaking poetic force than in the work of a 13th century Persian mystic who is now the best-selling poet in the United States, read mostly by people who have no idea he was one of the most rigorous theological intellects of the Islamic world. Rumi's entire poetic output, tens of thousands of verses in the Masnavi and the Divan-e-Shams, can be understood as a sustained, ecstatic meditation on a single image. The reed flute, cut from the reed bed, crying for its origin. The Masnavi opens with these lines, and they are not decorative. They are the whole philosophy compressed into a sound. The reed has been separated from the reed bed. Every note it produces is a cry of longing for reunion. Every human soul, for Rumi, is that reed. The music of human life, its joy, its grief, its love, its desire, is the sound of something that knows, at a level beneath language, that it was once part of a wholeness it can barely remember, and is always, in everything it does, reaching back toward it. But Rumi does not leave you in the longing. This is what separates him from simple romanticism. The reunion is possible, not after death, not in another life, now, in this breath. in this moment of stillness between thoughts. The Sufi tradition he inhabited, particularly the lineage of his teacher Shams of Tabriz, whose arrival in Rumi's life at the age of 37 catalyzed a complete interior transformation, taught that the return to unity is not achieved through intellectual understanding, but through what they called fana, the annihilation of the self in the divine, not the destruction of the person, but the dissolution of the illusion that the person is separate from God. What does that dissolution feel like? Rumi describes it in many ways, but perhaps most powerfully here. I have lived on the lip of insanity, wanting to know reasons, knocking on a door. It opens. I have been knocking from the inside. The door you have been looking for is the door you are standing behind. The separation you have been trying to overcome is the very thing doing the seeking. And when that is seen, when the seeker recognizes itself as what it was seeking, something happens that Rumi calls hayra, bewilderment, wonder, the complete dissolution of the ordinary categories of subject and object. This is the same experience Plotinus described, the same experience the Upanishadic sages described, and it is the same experience that, in the 13th century in a Franciscan friary in Italy, a theologian named Bonaventure described in a treatise called The Journey of the Mind to God, one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of Christian mysticism. Bonaventure, building on the thought of Augustine and the mystical theology of Pseudo-Dionysius, described the soul's ascent toward God as a movement through three stages: the exterior world, the interior world, and then something beyond both, what he called the apex mentis, the summit of the mind, the point at which the intellect exhausts itself and yields to something he called synderesis, the spark of the soul that is always already in contact with the divine. At the apex of this ascent, Bonaventure says, the soul passes beyond all intellectual categories and enters what he calls peaceful darkness, not the darkness of ignorance, but the darkness of excess, the way you go blind looking directly at the sun. God, for Bonaventure, is not found at the end of a philosophical argument. God is found at the point where philosophy collapses into silence, and what remains is pure loving awareness. What is extraordinary about Bonaventure is that he was not a fringe figure. He was the Minister General of the Franciscan Order, one of the most powerful ecclesiastical positions in medieval Europe. He was a systematic theologian who could hold his own in the universities of Paris. And yet at the center of his systematic theology was this mystical core. The soul and God are not fundamentally separate. The distance between the human soul and the divine is not a distance of substance, but a distance of attention. God is closer to you than you are to yourself, Augustine's phrase, which Bonaventure loved, because God is the very act of being that underlies your existence at every moment. Now let us go even deeper into the Christian mystical stream, because in the early 17th century, in a small town in what is now Germany, a shoemaker had an experience that produced one of the most startling mystical texts ever written, one that influenced Hegel, Schelling, Schopenhauer, and eventually made its way into the DNA of German idealism, and from there into virtually all of modern philosophy. Jakob Böhme was not a theologian. He was not a philosopher. He was a cobbler in Görlitz, and one afternoon in 1600, while sitting in his workshop, he noticed sunlight reflecting off a pewter dish, and something in that reflected light triggered an interior opening that lasted, in its most intense form, for about 15 minutes, and from which he spent the rest of his life, 24 years of writing, trying to articulate what he had seen. What he had seen, as best he could describe it, was the ground of existence itself. He called it the Ungrund, the groundless ground, the abyss that precedes all distinction, all polarity, all being. It was not God in any conventional sense. It was prior to God as a being. It was the condition of possibility for anything to exist at all, including divinity. And from this Ungrund, Böhme described a great self-revelation, the eternal will longing to know itself, dividing itself into darkness and light, contraction and expansion, will and love, the yes and the no. And in that division, creation itself emerges. Everything that exists is the product of this divine self-differentiation, this original longing of the one to know itself through multiplicity. And here is where Böhme converges with the Indian tradition in the most unexpected way. Because the Upanishads also describe Brahman's self-concealment as a kind of play. The Sanskrit word is lila, divine play, in which the Absolute hides itself within its own creation in order to experience the joy of rediscovery. The universe is Brahman playing hide and seek with itself. Every human being is Brahman pretending to be something that has forgotten it is Brahman. And the mystical awakening, the moment of unity consciousness, is the moment the game ends, and the Absolute recognizes itself in the mirror of an individual human face. Boehm would have understood this completely. He described the same structure, using completely different vocabulary, drawn from the wells of Christian Kabbalah and alchemical symbolism, and his insight filtered through centuries into figures like William Blake, who wrote, "If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite." Blake's doors of perception are Boehm's Ungrund. They are the Upanishads' Turiya. They are Plotinus's One, different windows looking out onto the same impossible, radiant fact. Now there is one more voice we need to hear before we arrive at the culminating movement of this journey. And it is perhaps the most surprising one, a voice that comes not from any formal mystical tradition, but from the cutting edge of 20th century depth psychology, and that found its way to the same conclusion through a completely different route. Carl Jung spent 50 years mapping the unconscious mind. What he found after decades of clinical work, dream analysis, and his own remarkable interior experiences documented in the Red Book was that beneath the personal unconscious, beneath the layer of individual memories, traumas, and complexes, there is a deeper layer he called the collective unconscious, a layer that is not personal, a layer that is shared, a layer that contains the same archetypal patterns, the same fundamental symbols, the same primordial images, in the psyches of people who have never met, in cultures that have never touched, across all of recorded history. The collective unconscious is not for Jung a mystical idea. It is a clinical observation. He arrived at it because his patients kept dreaming symbols they had no cultural access to. They kept producing, in their most distressed and their most illuminated moments, the same images that appeared in Gnostic texts they had never read, in alchemical manuscripts they had never seen, in myths from cultures they had never encountered. The implication which Jung followed with remarkable intellectual courage is that beneath individual psychology there is a shared psychological substrate, a layer of mind that is not mine or yours, but ours. A layer at which we are in some functional sense already one. Jung was careful never to make direct claims about metaphysics. He stayed, as much as he could, within the boundaries of empirical psychology. But toward the end of his life, in the extraordinary autobiographical work Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he allowed himself to speak more freely. He described experiences of synchronicity, moments of meaningful coincidence so improbable that they seemed to suggest a deeper order beneath the surface of causality. He described the self, not the ego self, but the deeper self with a capital S, as something that transcends the individual, as a center that encompasses both consciousness and the unconscious, both the personal and the transpersonal. And he said, in a passage that reads like a mystic speaking through a scientist's careful vocabulary, the decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? That is the telling question of his life. Every philosopher and mystic we have visited today was answering that question, and they were all answering it the same way. Yes, you are related to something infinite. You are not related to it as a creature is related to its creator, or as a child is related to a parent. You are related to it the way a wave is related to the ocean, the way a ray of light is related to the sun, the way a thought is related to the mind that thinks it, not external relation, identity. At the deepest level, what you are and what the universe is are the same thing, temporarily expressing itself through the beautiful, bewildering, irreplaceable particular form that is you. And this is where the practical dimension of all this philosophy becomes impossible to ignore. Because if this is true, even possibly true, it changes something, not as an abstract idea, as a lived orientation, as a way of moving through the world. If the apparent separation between you and others is not the deepest truth of what you are, then every act of cruelty is something the universe is doing to itself. Every act of compassion is the ocean recognizing itself in another wave. Every moment of genuine connection, that inexplicable recognition you feel sometimes with a stranger, that sense of having always known someone you just met, that feeling in certain landscapes or certain pieces of music where the boundary between you and the world becomes momentarily porous. Every one of those moments is not a departure from ordinary reality. It is a glimpse of what ordinary reality actually is, beneath the surface of the ego's careful maintenance of its own borders. The Sufi poet Hafiz, who was Rumi's great heir in the Persian tradition, wrote, "Even after all this time, the sun never says to the earth, 'You owe me.' Look what happens with a love like that. It lights the whole sky." The sun does not give its light because it expects return. It gives its light because giving is what it is. And the mystics are saying, this is your deepest nature too. Beneath the ego's economy of transaction and protection, beneath the careful accounting of who owes what to whom, there is something in you that gives the way the sun gives. Not because it has decided to, but because overflow is its nature. Because it is made of the same substance as everything else, and that substance, in its pure state, is what the traditions have always called love. This is not sentiment. This is ontology. This is a description of what love is at the level of being itself. Not a feeling that comes and goes, not an emotion dependent on circumstances, but the very structure of a universe that is, at its foundation, one thing knowing itself through the apparent multiplicity of its own expressions. Here is where everything we have explored converges into something that might briefly make the floor feel uncertain beneath you. We have followed this thread from Plotinus to the Upanishads, from Rumi to Bonaventure, from Boehmer to Jung. We have watched the same essential discovery surface in Alexandria and in ancient Indian forests, in Sufi poetry and in Christian monasteries, in a shoemaker's workshop in Görlitz and in a psychoanalyst's consulting room in Zurich. And at each stop on this journey, the discovery wore different clothes, different vocabularies, different cosmologies, different images and metaphors, but beneath all of that variation, it was always the same recognition. The self you take yourself to be is not the deepest thing you are. Beneath the personal, there is the universal. Beneath the individual, there is the whole. Beneath the wave, there is the ocean. But now we need to ask the question that all of this was building toward. The question that doesn't resolve into a comfortable answer, but opens instead into something much more vertiginous and alive. If the unity is real, if it is not metaphor but fact, not aspiration but description, then what is the separation? Where does it come from? Why does it feel so absolute, so undeniable, so much more real than the unity the mystics are pointing toward? The answer that emerges across all these traditions is startling in its consistency. The separation is not an error. It is not a fall. It is not a punishment or a mistake or a malfunction. The separation is a function. It is what the one does in order to know itself. It is what consciousness does in order to have experience. You cannot see your own face without a mirror. You cannot hear your own voice without the medium of air and the structure of ears and the mysterious translation of vibration into meaning. The absolute cannot know itself as absolute without, in some sense, becoming what it is not, becoming the finite, the particular, the individual, the limited, the mortal. This is what the Hindu tradition means by Maya. Maya is almost always translated as illusion, but that translation is imprecise in a way that creates enormous confusion. Maya does not mean that the world is not real. It does not mean that your particular life, your particular suffering, your particular joy is some kind of cosmic hallucination that you should stop taking seriously. Maya means something much more precise and much more interesting. It means that the world, as it appears to the ordinary ego-identified consciousness, is not appearing in its full nature. It is real, but it is appearing as less than it is. The wave is real. But if you see only the wave and never the ocean, you are missing something essential about what the wave is. And here is the twist that makes this philosophically explosive. The tradition that goes back to Shankara, the 8th century Indian philosopher who formulated the doctrine of Advaita Vedanta with a precision that has never been surpassed, says something that initially sounds absurd, and then, if you stay with it, begins to feel like the most obvious thing you have ever heard. The very consciousness with which you are right now trying to understand these ideas, the very awareness that is reading or listening to these words, the very something that it is like to be you, that is Brahman, not similar to Brahman, not a fragment of Brahman, Brahman itself, looking out through the temporary aperture of a particular human nervous system. You are not a being who has consciousness. You are consciousness that is temporarily having the experience of being a particular being. The difference between those two sentences is not grammatical, it is everything. Think of what this means for a moment. If you are consciousness itself, if awareness is not something you have but something you are, something that was not born when your body was born and will not die when your body dies, then your relationship to everything you have ever been afraid of changes completely. The fear of disappearing, which underlies almost every anxiety and almost every cruelty that human beings enact on each other, rests on the assumption that you are a particular form, and when the form dissolves, you dissolve with it. But what if the form is just a temporary pattern in something that has no beginning and no end? What if what you are is not the pattern but the medium in which all patterns arise? Meister Eckhart, the 14th century Dominican mystic whose sermons were so radical that he was posthumously condemned by the Pope, and so profound that Heidegger wrote his doctoral thesis on him, put it this way: "The eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love." This is not pantheism in any simple sense. Eckhart is not saying that you are God and therefore you can do anything you like. He is saying something much more precise and much more demanding, at the level of pure awareness, at the level of what Eckhart calls the grunt, the ground, the depth, the absolute interior of the soul. There is no distinction between the human and the divine. The ground of the soul and the ground of God are the same ground, not similar. The same. This was radical enough in the 14th century to nearly get him burned, but it is structurally identical to what Shankara was saying in the 8th century in India, and to what Plotinus was saying in the 3rd century in Alexandria, and to what the authors of the Upanishads were saying in the forests of ancient India 1,000 years before that. The same impossible world-dissolving recognition, surfacing again and again through the most rigorously trained contemplative minds humanity has produced. At the deepest level of what you are, the inside and the outside are the same. The seeker and the sought are the same. The lover and the beloved are the same. You have been looking for something that was looking. Now here is where the implications become personal, not philosophically personal, practically existentially, in the texture of your daily life personal, if this is even possibly true, and notice that you cannot simply dismiss it because the testimony is too vast, too consistent, too carefully reasoned to be waved away. Then something follows about how you exist in relation to other people, not as a moral imperative imposed from outside, as a logical consequence of what you actually are. If the consciousness in you and the consciousness in the person across from you are not two separate things, but two expressions of one thing, if the Atman in you and the Atman in them are, at the most fundamental level, the Brahman that neither of you is separate from, then the suffering of another person is not at that level, not your suffering, not because you should feel guilty about their suffering, or because you have an obligation to fix it, but because the membrane between self and other, which the ego takes to be solid and permanent, is actually, at the level the mystics are pointing toward, permeable, thin, in certain moments of genuine attention, almost transparent. You have felt this. This is the thing that the philosophical vocabulary is trying to describe, but which you already know from experience. You have felt it when you were genuinely moved by a piece of music, when for a moment the distance between you and the sound collapsed, and there was just the music happening without a separate listener. You have felt it in moments of deep love, when the person in front of you seemed to stop being an object in your world and became, briefly, the world itself. You have felt it in certain landscapes, mountains, oceans, deserts, where the usual busy narrative of self-consciousness goes quiet, and what remains is just this: presence, awareness, the extraordinary fact of being alive in a universe that is alive without any distance between you and it. Those moments are not departures from reality. They are not tricks of neurochemistry to be explained away, though neurochemistry is involved in everything you experience. Those moments are glimpses. They are the wave, for an instant, remembering the ocean. And every mystical tradition we have visited today is saying the same thing about those glimpses. They are not accidents. They are not random. They are available, not just occasionally but continuously, to anyone willing to turn their attention in the right direction, which is inward, which is downward into the ground of experience, which is, paradoxically, everywhere at once. The Zen tradition, which we have not yet explicitly visited but which converges on the same point from the East Asian direction, has a practice called Shoshin, beginner's mind. The instruction is simple: look at everything as if for the first time. Not because you should pretend ignorance of things you know, but because the ordinary habituated categorizing mind is constantly translating the raw experience of being alive into a story about being alive, and in that translation, something essential is always lost. The mystics are asking you to be interested in what is lost in the translation, to be interested in the experience before the story about the experience, to be interested in the awareness that is aware of both the experience and the story, and what you find there, what every one of these traditions is pointing toward, from Plotinus's One to Rumi's Reed Bed, to Boehmer's Ungrund, to Eckhart's Grunt, to the Upanishad's Turiya, is not a concept. It is not an idea you can add to your collection of interesting ideas. It is something that cannot be adequately named, though every tradition has tried, and the trying itself is beautiful. It is the ground, the source, the medium, the thing that is looking when you look and knowing when you know and being when you are, the thing that was never born and will never die, that contains all experiences without being any particular experience, that is closer to you than your own breath and has been waiting with infinite patience for you to stop looking elsewhere. This is what the mystics meant, not a sentiment, not a social philosophy, not a call for group harmony or global unity in the political sense, though perhaps it has implications there too. They meant something precise and verifiable not through instruments or arguments, but through the one instrument that has always been available, attention turned toward its own source. And so we arrive, after all this traveling, at the place where all philosophy eventually arrives, not at an answer, but at a quality of question, not at a conclusion, but at an opening. There is a line from the Kena Upanishad that has stayed with contemplatives for 3,000 years because it says the truest thing about this subject in the fewest possible words, that which is not thought by the mind, but by which they say, the mind thinks, know that alone as Brahman, not this which people worship here, the ground of knowing itself, the awareness behind awareness, the light by which all other lights are seen. You cannot see it the way you see an object, because it is not an object. You cannot think it the way you think a thought, because it is not a thought. But you can, and this is the extraordinary promise that every mystical tradition is making. You can be it. You already are it. The only question is whether you know it, whether you have turned around, as Plato's cave allegory suggests, and looked at the source of the light rather than at the shadows it casts on the wall. Every philosophy we have explored today is an invitation to turn around. The Hermetic tradition, the ancient current that flows from Egypt through Alexandria and resurfaces throughout Western esotericism, has a maxim that has been carved above doorways and written in the margins of manuscripts for 2 millennia, as above, so below, as within, so without. The macrocosm and the microcosm are the same structure, the same pattern, at different scales. What is true of the universe is true of the soul. What is true of the soul is true of the universe. The one is reflected in everything that proceeds from it, the way a single candle is reflected in every facet of a cut diamond. Many reflections, one source, and the reflections themselves are made of the same light as what they reflect. You are one of those reflections, but you are also at a level the reflection itself cannot see directly, the light. So here is the question that this journey leaves you with. Not a question to answer, a question to live with, to carry with you back into the ordinary moments of your day, the way you carry a stone in your pocket, present, weighted, reminding you of something by its very existence. If the consciousness reading or hearing these words right now is not a private possession, if it is the same awareness that looked out through the eyes of Plotinus in his moments of union, that burned in the chest of Rumi as he danced, that went still in Bonaventure at the apex of the mind, that opened in Jacob Boehme at the flash of reflected light, that the Upanishadic sages were pointing toward when they said, "You are that." If all of those eyes were windows in the same house, and you are in that house right now, have always been in that house, have never for a single moment been anywhere else, then who or what is aware of this sentence as it ends? Not you, the person with a name and a history and a collection of preferences and fears. Something prior to that. Something that was there before the name was given and will be there after the history is forgotten. Something that does not need to be found because it has never been lost. Something that the traditions have called by 100 names and that answers ultimately to none of them. The mystics called it the One. They called it Brahman. They called it the Tao. They called it God. They called it Shunyata, emptiness that is not empty but full beyond measure. They called it love, in the sense that Dante meant when he wrote the last line of the Divine Comedy, not romantic love, not affection, but the force that moves the sun and the other stars. The force that is not in the universe the way furniture is in a room, but that is the universe, expressing itself through every form that has ever existed, including this one, including yours. If these mysteries call to something in you, if some part of you recognizes even dimly, even through the noise of ordinary life, the shape of what these traditions are pointing toward, then you are already on the journey. You have always been on the journey. The only thing that ever changes is how awake you are to the fact that you are traveling. This channel exists to be a companion in that traveling, not a guide with a map and a destination, but a fellow wanderer, stopping at the same extraordinary vistas, asking the same questions that have no final answers, and therefore never stop being worth asking. The hunt continues, and perhaps the most astonishing thing about it is this: the hunter and the hunted have always been the same.